for Google Cloud Platform. So really understanding the fundamentals of GCP and how you can implement that within your business. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. Please ensure that your mute is on during the webinar. We're also recording this for distribution afterwards. And also any questions that you may have during the webinar, please add them to the chat or the Q&A. So without further ado, let's get started. Brilliant. So just as some formal introductions, I'm Danny Arak. I'm an account executive here at NetPremacy, really helping our customers and prospects to implement Google solutions across the three main pillars of Google Workspace, GCP, and Google Chrome. And yeah, really excited to share with you today our webinar on GCP. Tom?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Tom Anderson from NetPremacy. I'm a technical consultant here. I've been working in the consultancy space for about 5 or 6 years now and worked with quite a number of organizations who have started to adopt the cloud, seen a lot of different ways of approaching it. And I'm keen to kind of share that experience with you a little bit later on today. Other Tom?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tom Yarnell. Similar to Danny, an account exec with NetPremacy. I've been working at NetPremacy now, just coming up to about 8 months. Really excited to share some insights and talk with you this morning. Alex?
And hi from my side, I'm Alex McWilliam. I'm with Google and Google's professional services for the last 4 years and a bit. And so I have the privilege of working with our customers and together with our partners like NetPremacy in moving our customers to the cloud.
Brilliant. Yeah, so just to cover off today's agenda really quickly. So we're going to start off with myself giving an introduction to NetPremacy, followed by Tom Yarnell, who's going to discuss why Google Cloud Platform. He'll then be followed by Alex, who's going to cover the Google Cloud Adoption Framework. And then we'll finish off with Tom Anderson, who will be discussing notes from the field, and finally a Q&A. So let's get started on the introduction. Brilliant. So I can see a few familiar faces on the webinar today, but for those who are new to NetPremacy and GCP, I thought it'd be worthwhile to do a quick introduction before we move into the meat of the webinar. So who are NetPremacy? So NetPremacy are really proud to have been a premier partner since the very inception of the program in 2010. So to give you an idea, when we first started working alongside Google in the UK, they were just 25 people in that UK operation. So there's been a really huge level of investment from NetPremacy into the Google partnership, and we've really grown up alongside Google's methodology and services, which means that we're therefore deeply ingrained in not only the way that Google operates, but also the way that Google supports and services its customers. So in essence, we're really seen as an extension of Google's team, really looking to drive value into that customer base. So at NetPremacy, as you can see on the slide here, we've got 2 core pillars that we focus on. That first pillar is productivity and collaboration. So this first and foremost means being heavily focused on workplace and digital transformation. So we're really proud to have been awarded the 2019 Global Work Transformation Google Partner of the Year Award. And we not only have the largest workspace practice in the UK, but by far the most successful in the UK partner network due to those high levels of investment and services into those partnerships. The second pillar that NetPremacy focuses on is smarter analytics. So that essentially means building data pipes, data warehouses, and data lakes, and really using analytics to drive business results for organizations who are looking to capitalize on the data that they hold. As a result of that, we're really proud to be one of the top 3 GCP reseller partners in the UK. And we're also really excited about our recent partnership with Looker, which shows that we're on that next stage of developing our smarter analytics division. We're also investing heavily into our GCP offerings, which Tom Anderson will be covering later. So don't want to steal your thunder, Tom. But also, when it comes down to the data, which is at the heart of every business, NetPremacy is really positioned to help organizations ensure that they're getting the most out of that data. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Tom. So very quickly, who do NetPremacy work with and what verticals do we focus on? So I think this slide kind of speaks for itself. Yes, it's a bit of a boasting slide, but we're really proud here to show some of the high profile customers in a range of different industries that we work with. And this is only really a snapshot of some of the businesses who've chosen to partner with NetPremacy. There's no other Google base like this in the UK with these kind of high level logos. And these customers really choose to partner with Net Premises year after year because of the high levels of support and expertise that we provide. So as a quick example, Just Eat, we partnered with them back in 2012 when they were just a small tech startup, and we've partnered with them year after year, really helping them to grow into the success they are today by implementing technologies such as Google Workspace and BigQuery in GCP. So in a nutshell, Net Premises, we set up our customers to succeed from day one by providing those technical building blocks and fundamental building blocks to really maximize the use of their Google technology. So I'm now going to pass on to Tom Yarnell, who's going to discuss why Google Cloud Platform.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danny. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on really, you're looking to make that transition to the cloud and ultimately why that transition should be to Google's cloud. So I've really kind of put it down to 3 different reasons, really. I think, firstly, from a security point of view, it's so important for organizations, no matter what size. Google Cloud Platform powers the likes of Google Search and YouTube, and has been doing so for years. And that same global private network is trusted by millions of organizations and end users on a day-to-day basis. And some of those major organizations have ultimately come to trust Google with some of their most sensitive data. Organizations such as HSBC and Spotify trust Google for their day-to-day operations. The second point is sustainability. With it being Earth Day, I think last week, it's clear that organizations and governments are looking to make some serious changes to the way that they operate with regards to the climate. So in 2007, Google became carbon neutral. 2017, their global electricity usage was matched 100% by renewable energy. And ultimately, we've given ourselves some really tough targets. So by 2030, we want to be carbon free for 24/7. So I think the message here really is your path to sustainability as an organization really starts with the cloud provider that you decide to partner with. And it's clear that Google has set some really strong foundations and ultimately really, ambitious objectives for the future. And finally, I think innovation is a huge factor. The Google brand, shouldn't be understated. I think they're constantly investing in new products and updating the products that we know and love and use every single day, and across a multitude of market verticals as well. I also think the partner ecosystem that's aligned to Google Cloud, something that obviously Net Premises is part of, is designed and is there to hold your hand through the process. Like Danny has just mentioned, we want to see you thrive. And I think for me, ultimately as well, that's really exciting to build solutions and work with organizations to ultimately see you do really well as a result of partnering with Google. And I think that care is essentially what this session is about today, this webinar is about today. We want to see that you succeed, and to succeed, you have to get the basics right and understand actually what do I want to achieve as a result of going with Google and going into the cloud. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Alex, who can introduce the cloud adoption framework.
Thank you, Tom. And getting the basics right is actually thank you for the tee up. We should have rehearsed this. This is fantastic, because if assuming you have decided you want to go cloud and you have some idea of what are the kinds of solutions or things that you want to do with the cloud, the immediate next question becomes how? How are you going to do this? How are you going to scale this? How are you going to keep it secure? How are you going to manage this? How are you going to evangelize it within your organization? There are so many hows that need to be answered. Next slide, please. But the very first how question that you need to answer is how far you want to go. If you don't have this conversation, if you don't ask yourself this question, the cloud will become just yet another data center to you. But that's not what cloud can be for you. So this is a really important question to ask yourself. And as trivial as it may seem, if you ask your peers and your other decision makers in IT and in the business, from our experience, you might be surprised at just how widely the answers might differ. Right? The leadership may think, of course, we're going transformational. We're going to change our business. Right? If you talk to a lead architect, they may have strategic ambitions. If you talk to head of operations, they may be trying to work within a fixed budget and trying to get the most out of that, and they may have more tactical objectives. So this is a really important question to surface. As Google, we're trying to find ways to make cloud as simple and accessible to our customers as possible. And so this first core concept out of the Google Cloud Adoption Framework really just differentiates between 3 levels of cloud maturity: tactical, strategic, or transformational. Are you trying to just get to the cloud without rocking too much, changing too much, not introducing too much risk, really trying to get the short-term cost saving? Or are you looking to get more bang for your buck, so more value out of your IT? Or are you looking to do entirely new things with the cloud that you probably aren't doing today at all because it's not feasible or viable in your data center today? Next row, please. On this row, you just see kind of the typical canonical use cases that align to each of these three maturity stages. But because we're trying to keep it simple with this framework, really all you need to take away from this slide is, are you looking to move, change, or invent? Tom, if you could just hit the click button, please, then everybody can see what I'm talking about. Thank you. All right, this is the fundamental question that, and the fundamental conversation that you need to have with all your other peer decision makers, assuming that you are the champion for cloud and you're trying to evangelize cloud in your organization. So that's the first key concept of our framework. Next slide, please. The second idea that I'd like to share with you is this. This is a map. This is a map of all the things that you need to do when adopting cloud. These things have nothing to do with your actual applications or your actual solutions. These are kind of the organizational capabilities, the foundational aspects, your cloud operating model. The good news is this is everything. The bad news is it's a lot. The way we've structured this map is we've identified all the areas of concern as discrete work streams. That means if you structure your work according to this map, you can align the right stakeholders and you can make sure there's minimal overlap between the different work streams and the different decision-making processes. So this gives you a kind of idea of all the things you need to entertain. But there's another thing going on in this slide. This is not just a map, it's also a model. And the colored areas in this map are not by accident. What we've found in our work with customers is there's something special that happens at the intersection between people and process and technology, people, and then the three other themes. These topics in those colored areas are what we would consider your success factors. Investing more time and energy in these will drive your cloud adoption forward. You will be more successful. You will see more of the promise of cloud materialize when you invest more in that. The topics in the wider outer areas are necessary, but you might consider them to be a bit more like a hygiene factor. You will fail if you don't do them, but by over-investing in them, you're not going to adopt cloud more successfully. And so we're trying to really weight these different topics and encourage our customers to focus more of their energies on the intersections rather than at the outer areas. Whereas where you might in a traditional IT operating model might spend more time when you're running your own data centers. And so on the next slide, I'd like to zoom into these four, what we call themes, a little bit more. Your ability to continuously learn, effectively lead, efficiently scale, and comprehensively secure. Your ability to continuously learn is comprised of external experience from somebody who's done the cloud journey before, for example, net primacy, and your own people, your own specialists who know your business, who know your current IT the best, but maybe haven't done the journey before. Your ability to effectively lead is comprised of solid, comprehensive leadership top-down. By that, I mean a clear mandate, clear KPIs or OKRs, a budget, resource allocation that actually trickles down through the organization and doesn't kind of get lost somewhere in the middle between the folks who are actually trying to do the hard work and the C-suite who's driving the big decisions. And bottom-up teamwork, which by which we mean cross-functional small teams that can actually get the work done. Cloud adoption is inherently cross-functional, and so organizations that are more kind of functionally siloed or where the decision-making process is much more piecemeal struggle with this topic in particular. Your ability to efficiently scale is, well, this is where all the DevOps magic happens. And if you sometimes wonder, well, DevOps and cloud, why do I keep hearing these two concepts in the same sentence? These are not the same things. You are right, they are not the same thing, but they mutually benefit from one another. In the cloud, everything is an API. It means everything can be automated. And so your ability to efficiently scale depends on those kinds of factors. Having a process chain that can automate all change to your environment, expressing as much as possible as code rather than manual, human decisions, and having an architecture that is more resilient and more scalable. So if something does break or go wrong, it's not a total failure, maybe just single services degrade. Lastly, and most importantly, your ability to comprehensively secure, well, in the narrow sense of the definition, is about identity and access management. So making sure only the right people and the right services or devices have the right access to the right kind of targets or data. And data management, so understanding what's inside the safe. What am I actually protecting? Because sensitive data needs a different security model than, I don't know, public-facing internet data. But in the more holistic sense, your ability to comprehensively secure actually builds on those other three themes. Let me just illustrate the point a little bit. We've all heard examples of, zero-day exploits or security risks that a company just wasn't aware of and didn't know to patch because they didn't have the skills. They weren't up to date on the latest attack vectors in the software. Or maybe we've all heard stories in the press of companies that maybe had a more corrosive culture where issues were swept under the rug and not surfaced. That's a security risk. It's a cultural risk that impacts your security model. We all know stories of fat finger syndrome, just human error, right? Accidentally issuing the wrong command. Through automation, that can be mitigated. So that gives you a taste of how we treat security really as a holistic concern, and it's not just about firewall rules and access permissions. All right. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now is, and this is kind of the third key concept of the cloud adoption framework, is to bring these two ideas together, to bring the maturity scale of tactical, strategic, and transformational cloud maturity together with the 4 cloud adoption themes: learn, lead, scale, and secure. Because those 4 themes, those capabilities evolve over time, they mature over time. And so your ability to continuously learn will evolve from, at first, it'll be self-taught, it'll be a bit more ad hoc, there'll be pockets of knowledge. Maybe you have some engineers that know something about cloud, but not everybody. All the way to a future state, a transformational future state, where you have a culture of continuous learning, where you have practices and kind of a culture of learning, and where also your reliance on third parties to augment your staff or to bring in know-how is not quite as essential as it was before. You're using your partner to go faster, but you're not dependent on them because only they know something that you don't know. And no disrespect to net privacy. Next slide, please. Your ability to effectively lead will also go from teams being siloed by function. And really, it's all down to the project manager, that heroic project manager, to kind of connect the dots and to make sure the right people are talking to the right people. Like I said, cloud adoption is an inherently cross-functional exercise. To a future state where you have lots of small cross-functional teams that own their own services and own their own projects and enjoy greater autonomy around the kind of tools they use and where they can communicate with other teams and other services through APIs. Next slide, please. Your ability to efficiently scale will evolve from, in very plain terms, from a world in which change is bad and risky and to be avoided at all costs and done as infrequently as possible, being a bit facetious here, to a future state where change is normal. It happens every day and it's low risk. And if something does go wrong, then the time to recovery is very short. Right? This is the DevOps promise. Next slide, please. And lastly, your ability to comprehensively secure will evolve from a, again, simplified binary notion of the internet is evil and everything in my data center is a safe space, to a future state where everything is evil, quite frankly. It doesn't matter where it is. And the only way to be secure is to trust the right people and the right devices in the right context, accessing the right kind of services for the right reasons. So defense and depth. Okay. Next slide, please. So I've given you a taste of those 3 concepts: the maturity scale, the 4 cloud adoption themes, and how those 2 kind of fit together and evolve over time. So what can we do with that? One exercise we can do, and Tom alluded to it earlier, is do a cloud maturity assessment. There are many different ways in which you can do this. You can do this yourself. There's actually a site online on the Google website you can do this with. The best way to do this is together with your partner, because this will take a more in-depth workshop. And normally there are one of two learnings that come out of this cloud maturity assessment. One is that these 4 themes are not equally mature, so that you're spiking ahead on some and you're behind on others. And that will give you an indication that you've overinvested or underinvested in 1 or 2 of these areas. And then it's worth, closing the gap. Why is it worth closing the gap? Well, because it depends on what you're trying to solve for. What is your business objective? If you only have tactical objectives, there's no return on investment in being strategic on your capabilities. You're basically more capable than you're taking advantage of most often. The other scenario is more likely. You have grand ambitions, rightly so, but your capabilities are not quite there yet. And that's the other insight from this cloud maturity assessment, that not one of these 4 capabilities is not aligned to the others. It's that all 4 of them are not aligned with what you're trying to solve for. And so in that case, it means either really doubling down on these capabilities and investing a lot of time and energy in maturing them, or it means simplifying your use cases, at least in the short term. So for example, it may mean do a lift and shift scenario for now, for the next 6 months. Do that well, and then progress to modernizing your applications in a second step, rather than trying to make that leap right away. That's the kind of scenario that I'm talking about. All right. In a nutshell, that was just kind of the crash course on the Google Cloud Adoption Framework. There's much more to know about it. Thank you. So this is the link to the website. It contains the white paper and a bunch of other complementary materials. And with that, I'd like to hand it on.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex. Tom, if we could click on just one slide for the moment. If we pause here for a second. Alex has raised some really interesting points there about that cloud adoption journey. And when I was thinking about what to kind of talk about in this webinar today, I was thinking about all the different organizations that we at Net Primacy, but also me personally, have kind of interacted with, who are at some stage of that cloud adoption journey. And I think Alex touched on a really important point here, right? Is that it's not necessarily the kind of the scale and the maturity that you're at the moment. It's that relative measure of where you're trying to get to, answering that question for your business. Where do I want to be in my cloud maturity? That is so important in actually measuring how you're doing in that cloud adoption journey. If your actual desire is just to be strategic in the way that you adopt cloud, then absolutely, that's perfectly fine. Make sure that the effort and investment that you're putting towards the cloud is going towards getting to that particular goal. Like Alex says, don't overinvest in certain areas to try and get to transformational, if actually transformational is way too far off where you are today. So what I did is I went out to the industry, I went out to some of our customers, some of our colleagues, and tried to get a little bit of their thoughts around cloud adoption. And some of the organizations have been through the CMA process, the Cloud Maturity Assessment process, and some of them have kind of try and tackle it on their own. So what I've done is I've kind of split this out into 2 different sections. I've got the thoughts that kind of Net Primacy has around what we've seen from an external view of what lots of different organizations have done. And then what I've done is I've actually captured some of the distinct comments and distinct kind of lessons learned that our customers have actually, taken from this cloud adoption journey. But again, I must stress it is so important to understand that you need to know where you are trying to get to. Having a look at what some of the lessons learned that other customers have kind of achieved is great. But actually, some of these lessons learned might not even be applicable to you because they're in a different kind of maturity level to where you're trying to get to. So without further ado, Tom, if we can kind of click on, what do we think about kind of cloud adoption in the industry? Well, actually, the cloud adoption framework's 4 themes actually provide a really good structure to cloud adoption. As Alex mentioned, there are lots of different work streams. There are lots of different kind of areas. It's really important to make sure that we focus that effort in the areas that are important to us. It's really useful to use that adoption framework to define what actually matters to you in your journey to the cloud. Trying to tackle everything all in one go is an absolute recipe for disaster. Focus on those areas that you want to get a little bit better in your maturity. And actually, it kind of leads me on quite nicely to that second point. We're not so naive to understand that GCP is kind of the be all and end all. We understand that GCP has a role to play in an organization, that cloud has a role to play in an organization in its technology stack. Give GCP an identity, right? Give it an identity in that stack. Understand why it is that you are actually moving to the cloud. Lots of people, we kind of to the cloud because they've heard it's what they need to be doing. But actually look internally at what the problems that you're trying to solve are and focus your efforts on solving them in the cloud. You know, having goals really helps with that kind of executive buy-in and that lead theme. But actually, there are lots of good reasons to move to the cloud. Understand specifically why you are moving to the cloud. If you can nail that, you will be miles ahead of quite a lot of different organizations that we're kind of speaking to. Make sure it's also not just IT that's driving that cloud adoption. This is an easy thing to kind of state. It's a very difficult thing in practice to put in place. You know, IT is very often seen as a supporting function, but actually in order to be truly successful and truly transformational in the cloud, there needs to be a kind of a paradigm shift in the role that IT plays in the organization. And it's important to understand that this is not something that you can just click and be done with. You absolutely need to work at this. You need to kind of set that as a goal, set that as a kind of a target for your maturity in that space, in that lead theme, and actually make sure that IT is kind of growing and maturing along that journey and making sure that it's kind of transforming between that supporting function to that center of excellence. That is absolutely the transformation that needs to happen. It is a big cultural shift. It is a big change to a lot of organizations. But it's really, it is quite important to kind of enabling cloud adoption. Points 4 and 5, I kind of separated them out, but ultimately they boil down to the same fundamental thing. It's about the foundations, right? Regardless of what you're doing in the cloud, there are lots of different ways to piece the Lego bricks together, piece the services and products together to build some really cool things. But actually, there's also some really cool ways of just using the technology, right? With lift and shift and using platform as a service and managed services. Ultimately, they are all underpinned by a set of foundations. We call them the brilliant basics, right? You absolutely need to get them right early on. I kind of have a very short phrase that I always say to organizations when we're talking about these foundations. Do them once, do them right, and do them early. Get them done, get them kind of correct from the start. It's always easy to kind of iterate and kind of improve on those in the future. It's really, really hard to go and apply governance retrospectively. It's not impossible. It is something that we do work with organizations on, but it is a lot harder to kind of have to go back and unpick all of that kind of governance that you put in place that was kind of not aligned with where you're trying to strategically get to. So it is important if you're at that early stage of your cloud adoption, or actually if you're thinking about kind of changing the way that you are adopting cloud, set those foundations up really, really early on, set them up correctly, and kind of you will only ever need to do them once, and it will allow you and unlock you to be able to actually experiment with the technology a lot easier. And actually it will help you along that cloud adoption and actually help you along that maturity assessment as well, because you'll have a much clearer idea of how you can get from the maturity that you are today to kind of the maturity that you're trying to get to. If we can click on Tom, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that our kind of customers and some of the industry experts kind of in the field said. We're kind of going to go anti-clockwise around this slide. Because the first thing that I want to highlight is that this was kind of a summary of a lot of different organizations and what they kind of spoke about. Think about the non-technical elements of the cloud as early on as possible, right? These are the things that when you're reading about GCP, when you're reading setting up an organization, they're the first 2 pages that you read, right? Resource hierarchy and IAM inheritance. Super basic, super straightforward, super simple. You will be amazed at how many organizations have been working with the cloud for many, many years, still don't have this right, are still working on kind of improving this. If you can get your resource hierarchy defined early on, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to have a good kind of level of founding principles or kind of guiding principles. If you can get things like that and understand how IAM inheritance works in GCP, you are immediately kind of a step ahead of kind of those organizations that have just kind of tried to retrospectively fit all of their projects. If you can do this first, do it right, it is so easy to kind of then extend and kind of experiment with the technologies. If you have to do it further down the line, it is a lot of effort. That is kind of where we spend a lot of time with our customers, is kind of unpicking and kind of checking on their homework about what they've done in that particular field, and actually trying to unpick and get back to the foundations in that space. Similarly, an area that kind of is often kind of at the forefront of people's minds when they think about moving to cloud, but actually is still quite an important one to think about when you're setting up these foundations. It kind of comes under that term of FinOps, right? Financial operations. Make sure you're putting in cost controls in fairly early and doing them right, because actually, while we can experiment with the cloud and get things kind of really, really quickly spun up, it is important to make sure that we do it in a controlled manner. The kind of the adoption framework helps with setting up that governance and helps with understanding where we're trying to get to across that kind of people, process, technology kind of trifecta, and understanding what we can do to be more mature in that space. But ultimately, cost control is kind of often the driving force behind whether cloud can be successful or not. It's very easy for things to get out of control and get stops if we're not thinking about these types of things. Some little kind of nuggets of information. There's things like community tutorials in GCP around shutting down idle VMs automatically, right? It's a really straightforward process, and actually implement it really early on. And actually, it kind of puts that bit of a safety net underneath your kind of experimentation. Cloud logging on non-prod projects. This is a constant kind of thing that we see across organizations. Change the default retention period. And actually, as a more holistic kind of view, try and move towards proactive cost optimization. Bring that into that kind of that scale theme, and actually bring that into the architecture that you're building. Try and proactively be aware of how much your services are consuming and actually the cost associated with them, rather than reacting to something that's happened in the past. Reactive cost optimization is always going to be a little bit more kind of emotional, a little bit more dramatic than proactively making sure that we're kind of building very, very optimally for what we're trying to achieve. And similarly with security, embrace the cloud security model. Don't try and replicate on-prem configuration. They are two different areas, two different ways of building with technology. Things like role-based access control is really, really easy in the cloud because of the way that IAM kind of is structured, because of the way that we can really granularly define what people are able to do in the cloud. Don't just try and replicate what you got on premise, because that's what's always been there. Yes, it's a little bit of work to kind of transition the way of thinking and actually change those policies, but put the effort in and do it, because if you can actually get role-based access control right, your security team and your kind of security officers will thank you for it 10 times over. Because again, it's one of those areas that's really hard to unpick at a future date, is that if you start granting primitive roles all over the place, give everybody access to do everything in GCP, it's really difficult to kind of unpick that. A really interesting one that came from one of our customers is actually around that theme of automation, right? Alex talked about it a little bit earlier. Everything in GCP has an API attached to it, makes it really easy to automate. Things like service keys for service accounts. You can automate the rotation of them, automate the kind of the management of those. Again, that is an area that is probably quite far ahead for a lot of organizations, but think about it, add it to your kind of target, add it to your goal. Say, hey, we want to get to a position where we're automating a lot of these different kind of factors in our organization. One that was really interesting that I wanted to highlight on the last one on this particular page is that the cloud is an ever-evolving environment. And this is actually where somebody like Net Primacy and the work that we do with our customers can actually be really beneficial, because there are a lot of things being released. There are a lot of things being changed in Google Clouds. Google as an organization is very, very innovative and is very, very agile in the way that it kind of develops new functions and features. Some of those functions and features can help accelerate that maturity, right? Accelerate your journey into the cloud. Be aware of them. Start talking to people like Net Primacy. Start interacting on webinars like these where we're trying to present some of this information. Get involved in the Google Cloud community, because there's a lot going on. That would be my kind of message on that one. I've got one more slide about what some of our customers talked about. Tom, if you could kind of flick onto it. And these are very much kind of around the strategic direction of where you're going with the cloud and actually how you support that journey to the cloud, thinking internally, not just at the technology side, but actually more on the kind of the people and the process side as well. Training, it's really important to make sure that, like Alex was saying, we leverage those kind of external parties and actually leverage partners like NetPremacy and actually the content that Google puts out there across the industry. It's really important to align that kind of training that you're putting into the organization with that strategy that you're using for the cloud, right? If you are looking to, as a kind of a strategy, adopt the cloud for your infrastructure and adopt it to kind of help modernize that kind of on-premise infrastructure that you've got, there's no need to start looking at machine learning training and machine learning certifications if all you're ever going to use is compute, right? Focus that effort on upskilling the internal resources that you have in the areas that you're going to work with immediately. It's very easy to kind of set a training plan and say, hey, we're going to learn everything about the cloud, and actually training them becomes quite a burden on a lot of these organizations. We heard back from a couple of organizations that it's really important to kind of focus that in. And actually, when you're bringing in new hires as well, think about how you can bring in new hires who have cloud experience, but actually make sure that that cloud experience is there to support the development of your internal employees, right? The people who are already working for your business. It's great to go out to the market and pull these cloud kind of skills from the external view, but your internal resources at the moment have so much experience around your existing infrastructure, your existing kind of strategy. It's important to make sure we're upskilling them as well as bringing in that external resource. So what I'm trying to say there is don't just replace that entire IT team with people who have cloud experience, right? Bring in one or two people who have that cloud experience to help support the development of those existing kind of employees. And actually, one of the things that is really important when we look at that different level of maturity, when we look at that kind of tactical, strategic, and transformational, we saw this earlier on in a different slide, but where you can, have a goal to try and move towards product ownership and that mentality of kind of a product and a service that is offered to the business rather than a project driven, we need to do this particular project with this particular goal. Have a sense of ownership of the technology, of the platform, of the service within the organization. This is a huge, huge cultural shift for a lot of organizations. There are a lot of organizations who have done project driven approaches before, who have done project driven approaches all the time, who have never had a kind of a product owner role within the organization. Have a think about how you can introduce that concept, because what we find is organizations that adopt a product ownership mentality are a lot more successful in their kind of use and expansion of use of the cloud, and actually their adoption is very much driven by that kind of product ownership. And then finally, another one that was really good to hear from one of our customers, because it's actually something that Alex said earlier on. Don't use the cloud as a data center. It can be used in that way. It absolutely shouldn't be used in that way. See it as a platform, right? See it as tools and services, see it as that box of Lego bricks that you can build on top of. Yes, you could build a great big wall or a great big house that's very simple, but you could also build something that's really innovative and really cool, using some of those old components as well. It's not just a case of, hey, what we've got at the moment needs to go into a different place. We need to just kind of shift it into the cloud because it's a new data center. Think about how the products and services that are offered as part of the platform can be integrated into that architecture and look at moving that in a different way. If we can click on Tom, I'm conscious of time and I do like to waffle, I'm afraid. How do we actually help organizations with their cloud adoption? Well, it really does depend on what you're trying to answer, right? It depends on where you are in that maturity, where you are on that journey. We speak to a lot of organizations that have no idea. They've never started using GCP before. They've never started using cloud before. We actually have an offering in that space called the GCP onboarding. It kind of takes you from zero to hero, get those foundations in place for GCP, and gets you to a position where you're able to start experimenting with the cloud, right? Start using some of these technologies, start using some of these products and services, and just get going with it. If we have organizations that have kind of dabbled in it a little bit, who have kind of taken that leap into cloud, experimented with it, but have actually not thought about those kind of foundational elements, that governance, we do actually also have a slightly modified version of that called the GCP Health Check. This is where we kind of start with where you are at the moment rather than starting from zero, and kind of measure where we're trying to get to in terms of those foundations. We try and peel them back all the way back to those foundational elements and say, hey, let's just make sure we're kind of focusing on putting those right before we start experimenting. But actually, we can also go through, and what we're starting to do a lot more with our kind of organizations is to start to use the adoption framework to drive that structure behind cloud adoption. You know, it's not always the case that people want to go all the way back to the foundations. It's not always the case that we need to kind of address those foundations. Very often it's kind of the entire kind of cloud adoption framework that we need to look at and actually start assessing. That is where we can start going through, as Alex mentioned, the cloud maturity assessment. We can look at cloud adoption as a whole and say, hey, if we look at that kind of those technical foundations, that's fine. That's one element, that's one work stream. But actually, there are so many other things we need to consider. That is where the cloud adoption framework really excels, is kind of looking at that cloud adoption as a whole. And actually, if you're an organization that's kind of starting in the cloud or has looked at the cloud in the past and kind of has a certain position, but doesn't quite know where you are on that cloud journey, the CMA is an absolutely brilliant tool to use to just benchmark yourself and say, hey, here's where I am today, and actually helps you put that structure around where you're trying to get to. So the adoption framework is one of those exercises that I love to go through with organizations. It's always really insightful. We went through it with a customer just last week, and every other sentence was, oh my gosh, do we actually do that? Are we actually that? Is that actually where we are? We need to get better in this space. We need to get better in that space. So it's really interesting to kind of hear the feedback that we get from those things. I think I'm going to pass on next to Tom or Danny, one of you two.
Yeah, me.
Absolutely, Danny. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. But Danny, over to you, my friend.
Perfect. Cheers, Tom. Well, yeah, thanks everyone again for joining us today. So in terms of next steps, there'll be a few things that we'll send over to your way. Firstly, we'll be sending a feedback form to help us improve for next time, and also a recording of the webinar as well. And on top of that, we're also going to send you a Google Cloud Adoption Framework, the white paper for that. And we'll also be in touch around your cloud adoption journey to see if NetPremacy can support in any way.